Você está no canal Brasil, uma realização da Fé Comércio São Paulo, que hoje conversa com a pesquisadora Alison Federca. Esta é a terceira entrevista da nova série do canal, produzida em parceria com a revista Problemas Brasileiros. É a série Brasil Visto de Fora, em que vamos conversar com especialistas estrangeiros e brasileiros de vários cantos do mundo para entender, sob a ótica deles, um pouco mais sobre o nosso país. A primeira conversa foi com o professor Marshall Ikin e a segunda com a embaixadora Irene Vidagala. As duas já estão disponíveis no nosso canal no YouTube e no site da revista PB. Antes de iniciar a entrevista, eu te lembro de se inscrever aqui no canal e de nos seguir nas redes sociais. Alison Federca é diretora de análises do think tank americano Geopolitical Futures. Além de escrever análises, ela supervisiona a qualidade dos estudos e previsões desenvolvidos pelo Centro de Pesquisas. Especialista em questões ligadas à América Latina, ela morou na Argentina e no Brasil, quando desenvolveu uma pesquisa sobre Brasil e Angola e a cooperação Sul-Sul. Nesta conversa, vamos falar sobre o lugar do Brasil no mundo contemporâneo, avaliando a ascensão e queda do prestígio nacional e o que o país pode alcançar no futuro. Hello, Alison. Welcome to the Brasil channel.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for having me.
So, this series of interviews are concerned with understanding how Brazil is seen from abroad. Looking from Washington, D.C. in 2021, what do you think is the most prevalent perception about the country nowadays?
So I think the prevalent thing that we see a lot about Brazil these days is there's this the saying, right, that Brazil is always a developing country that never quite develops. That saying's been around for a while. It's not anything particularly new, but I still think it's relevant in terms of the perception that people have of Brazil, especially in the more recent years.
But if we think back to 2010, for example, that period, a year after The Economist put the crisis as a rocket on its cover, and people were talking about Brazil booming and Brazil being more popular, and there was a lot of discussion about the rise of the country. Although it's the same thing that you're saying, that the country is always emerging. At that period, it seemed like things were going right for the country. How different do you think it is nowadays?
It my particular think tank specifically, but in general, when you think about a country's ability to be an emerging actor globally, either as a leader for the region, as a leader for the hemisphere, as a leader for any type of global interaction where it has power, you need to have fundamental characteristics in place because you need to have a foundation on which you can build that power. So the fundamentals still exist in Brazil. It could never be considered an emerging power if it didn't have the fundamentals in place. Now, from those fundamentals, a country will always need to be able to build on them, to cultivate that power, to solve any type of internal problems that they have domestically, because you can't project power if you can't take care of your own country first. So there's a little bit of house cleaning that always goes on before a country can kind of graduate to that level of projecting outwards. So that's one thing to keep in mind with Brazil, is that the structure there in terms of natural resources, population, fairly favorable demographics, a large domestic consumption base with little reliance on exports. I mean, all of these things are very favorable for Brazil in terms of its potential to be a major player in the world. The other thing I think to keep in mind is when we hear people talking about Brazil a lot, because it's far away from most people in the Southern Hemisphere, we talk about just Brazil, right? And we forget that Brazil exists in the world with the rest of the global economy. And so when you think about, oh, look at what happened in 2010 afterwards, things took a nosedive. Some of that is domestic, especially in the political sphere. But when we think about the global economy, the fallout from the 2008 financial crisis affected everybody. And some of the economic problems that I think Brazil encountered stemmed from that just as much as it did from any type of domestic mismanagement. And even today, when we look at the global environment of how does Brazil's economy recover, there are a lot of domestic questions that need to be answered. But at the same time, looking at the global trade patterns that have been severely disrupted because of the pandemic, the FDI flows, which are now severely restricted because of the pandemic, all of these things that Brazil was looking at before to help solve some of its economic problems are no longer as readily available. And that is, not necessarily something that is specifically Brazil's fault, but part of the global dynamics in which Brazil exists. And I think a lot of times people forget to apply some of the global trends that we see in the rest of the world that we talk about with China, the US, and Europe, and apply them in places like Brazil as well, because they're equally affected, albeit perhaps in a different expression or a different way.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, you talk a lot about domestic problems and things that Brazil should look inward to fix. What do you think should be the priorities in this case? You talked about the political side of it, but the economics has changed a lot since 2010 as well. I mean, since 2013, we've seen a crisis after the other. So is politics and the economics the two sides of that? What should be the focus of the country in fixing its problems, as you say?
So with the economics, I think Brazil's they understand this already, because throughout multiple administrations, there's been discussions of the need for economic reforms, tax reforms. What else were some of them? The administration reforms of how public servants are employed, government spending reforms. There's been a lot of discussion over how do we privatization, all these things. They've been discussed through various administrations. And this is something that, independent of most political parties, there is a general understanding of we need to get these reforms through. And so because you have that type of national consciousness over what needs to be done economically, I think that pursuing those will keep moving things in the right direction, because you need to, again, have a strong base for this. With that in mind, you can start to think a little bit more about the political, because that's really where things get tripped up. And from my perspective, you mentioned 2013 in terms of the beginning of political problems. We saw a lot in 2015 with the impeachment. And so I think the other thing is to keep in mind that the political crisis that Brazil is undergoing right now is the same in many ways as 2013 or 15. It's a continuation, right? It wasn't, the crisis of Dilma is very not separate from the crisis of Bolsonaro, which isn't separate from Lula going to jail or Temer having like a 6% approval rating when he was taking over office. So it's the root of that, I believe, it's the diversity of Brazil, right? You have two very different economic regions if you compare the Northeast with the South, and everything in between. And so you constantly have this major challenge of how do we balance the economic and political policies that we need to create a good lifestyle for people in one region and service the needs of people in a different region. And they have fundamentally different needs. They have fundamentally different desires. And that is the biggest, I think, challenge facing any government in Brazil, is how do you reconcile those two competing demands and find a way to move forward politically so that you can have your constituents have their needs met at the same time and not alienate yourself from half the country. And that's very hard to do. Don't get me wrong. The US has the same problem right now. The country's basically split 50-50. And you have half the country supporting the presidential leader now, just as they did during the Trump administration, and the other half absolutely hates the government, and the government can do no right, no matter who you talk to on those sides. So it's a very difficult situation. I'm not saying it's easy to solve, but I think that's the underlying factor for why there's so much political unrest right now.
You talk about the continuation since 2013, all those crises, but a lot of people see in the election of Bolsonaro in 2018 a breaking point, something that changed in the political system in Brazil. How do you assess that? What do you think about? Do you think it really changed that much, and what are the consequences of that?
Right. So I see Bolsonaro as a bit of a reflection of how do I say this? Of social forces. Right. So if you think of a political leader as the product of a social force, then we can say something along the lines of he marks something new, because there is a new group of people that he represented that propelled him into power because he got their votes. Right. If you think about it from the perspective, okay, there was two terms of Lula, you had Dilma for a while, that did not end well. And so there was this general rejection of the left, of PT, of all of these traditional powers. And also because of the Lava Jato scandal, a general disillusionment with the traditional political system. No party was spared in the corruption investigation with that. And that was also really problematic. people were finding at the time more confidence in justices and judges in the court system than they were with politicians in traditional political institutions. And so when you have a candidate come along that represents a swing in the opposite direction, I see it as a backlash or as a recognition of a force saying, we've tried the traditional doesn't work. We want to try something new. What options do we have? And from that, you see a Bolsonaro emerge. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he will be, a continuation of him will happen. Just because you're given a chance to try something new, if you don't succeed, the people will still hold you accountable. And so that doesn't mean he's here to stay. It could very well mean that you see a swing back to the status quo ante, or you see another type of third-party actor for something different to emerge.
But do you see any risks for democracy or for the stabilization of the country? Because I saw one of the analysis of geopolitical futures talking about the presence of the military in the government, which is much different than it was before. And in the case of Brazil, it always leads us to think about the dictatorship that was in the country for more than 20 years. And when the rise of Bolsonaro was seen for a lot of people as a threat to democracy.
I think there's a danger of discussing things in terms of, it's a fine line between political crises and institutional crises and developing as part of the natural evolution of systems, and assuming that every time that there's a crisis, that democracy is at risk. That's not to say that it's never at risk, but it's very easy to say that without it necessarily being true. With the case of the military in Brazil, as you mentioned already, it is very delicate because of the national history. And it is a very fine line, I think, that's being walked right now. I think the military itself has done a good job in terms of, you see a lot of their top brass commenting on, we need to stay separate, we need to honor the Constitution, we serve the Constitution, not the president. And so there is this consciousness, I think, both in a lot of the politicians, but also especially within the military, of needing to maintain their institution as separate. And there are political issues that keep trying to pull them back in. And you see this fight back and forth between the two institutions. But as long as I think you see that fight going on, it's reason to believe that there is still a separation there, and that those barriers are being respected. And I think it's also important to remember the place of where the military in Brazil is at right now in terms as an institution itself, right? So you had a backlash against the military in many countries in Latin America post-dictatorships, in military regimes. And now you're in a region where there's not that much interstate warfare between countries. So what do you do with your military? You have to have it. What is it? What's its purpose? What security role does it serve for you? And I think each country is trying to figure that out. And so the military is also trying to figure that out as well in terms of border controls, how it interacts with different institutions. And that also kind of comes into part of that political dialogue as well.
Going back to another answer of yours in the beginning, when you were talking about how Brazil is in the context of the world, and we have to think about the other countries as well. And thinking about this situation with the military and the talk about threat to democracy and stuff like that, it's interesting to compare the situation of Brazil in 1964 when the dictatorship started and the situation today with this discussion about the role of the military and the situation of the rest of the world. I mean, we can talk about the Brazil-US relations, which in 64 was really pro-change and pro the coup that brought the military to power. And now Brazil having a very strange relation with the US since Trump left power, since Bolsonaro was so close to the ideas of Trump, and he rejected the idea of the election of Biden being, he talked about it being fraudulent. He talked about Trump actually winning. He was one of the last presidents in the world to recognize that the election of Biden. How do you think that relation between Brazil and the US can be stressed in this period when we're talking about the presence of the military, the rejection of Biden by Bolsonaro?
Again, looking at the rest of the world, right? So with your point on 64, that was the top of the Cold War. The Cold War governed pretty much all international relations imaginable in one way or another. That theme touched on how these countries behaved anywhere in the world, that somebody somewhere knew Russia or the Soviet Union or the US. That's just the way the reality was back then. Now, especially in the Western Hemisphere, the big elephant in the room in the governing international dynamic is US-China ties. And so I would think in terms of the Brazilian relationship with the US, there is an independent relationship of just a bilateral nature where there is an interest in trade. And with respect to something like that, you will always have business principles kind of governing that. Where can you make a sale? Where do you actually have a competitive advantage? What supplies do you need? Market concerns, things like that. Then you have this, the political and the security question of being in the same hemisphere and having to worry about security issues with, say, telecommunication systems, surveillance and technology and things like that. And that's where I think the US relationship with Brazil will pivot a lot in terms of how everyone manages the US-China relationship. Nobody's asking any country to say you have to choose one or the other. Sometimes it's presented that way, but in a realistic world, you're not going to see a binary decision, right? You have to balance one or the other and kind of choose which path might be most advantageous for you. And I think that relationship is what's going to have the most stress on any US-Brazilian ties, is how do you deal with China? And that is going to stay the same under Biden, right? So there's certain issues that the Biden administration will take, especially in terms of rhetoric because of his political party affiliation, which is very different from Trump. But one of the underlining constants has been the US animosity towards China, the US trade war towards China. And that's been true for both administrations. And I think will figure prominently in this administration for the remainder of its time. And as a result, it will impact the US-Brazil ties because that's a constant.
And how do you see Brazil making that's the choice between China, our biggest trading partner, and the US, one of the most important historic allies of the country?
Yes, I see this as the biggest challenge Brazil has had, right? So it's a huge country with a lot of potential. And if you look at a lot of its foreign policy in the past, it's tried very hard not to choose any one side. It has made a name for itself as kind of the mediator, the peacemaker. Everybody gets along with Brazil. Brazil can be friends with anybody. And that can work for a long time. And if that's the path that Brazil wants, that they can do that path. But when you want to become a powerful country or a leadership country, you have to have some clarity in terms of what are your imperatives, what are your goals. And that comes at a cost, right? You need to be able to pursue something and accept a cost that comes with the power that you're seeking or the role that you're seeking in society. This is very hard for Brazil to do. It doesn't want to make that choice. They had to have civilian boats sunk off of their shores to commit troops in World War II. That's a very drastic event and a very catastrophic event to happen to force Brazil to choose a side. So we know that in the past, it has to be very extreme for that sort of thing to happen. What we're seeing now is this is, I think, if it happens, I see it as a rite of passage, right? Does Brazil want to enter the big leagues? Does it want to assume responsibility and realize it probably can't be friends and be all things to all people all of the time? And if it wants to be that, then that's going to hold it back from ever emerging as a global player that can call the shots or leverage its power. And it needs to make a decision on, does it want to use the power potential that it has and be willing to project that power and try to leverage that in different negotiations with countries, be it the United States, China, or others. And that's going to mean making some hard decisions and taking the consequences of those decisions. And that's very hard. They've had a very hard time, both because of internal differences of opinion over which is the better path to take, but then also just the general concept of not being able to just kind of have a hands-off approach on things.
But do you think it would be possible for the country to take a side like that? I mean, considering that we're talking about a decade of very hardship in terms of economic, considering that we have considering that it will probably mean aligning with the US because it's a more historical, it's a relationship that has a longer history and is probably more important, especially if we think about Bolsonaro, who rejects China and talks about communism a lot. But at the same time, we really are dependent on China nowadays because of trade. So how would it be possible for Brazil to choose one side like this?
So I don't think it has to necessarily choose outright. And I think that it's not in the strongest position to necessarily make any demands right now, because as you pointed out, there's still a period of political consolidation that's necessary, because right now there's no strong political player. There's a lot of tensions and separation of powers within different political parties. And then there's also the economic question. You need some type of economic recovery with the structural changes in place. In terms of what they can do with the US and China, the trick is to, because Brazil they want investment and they want to be able to export high value added goods. The US is a great source for that. China, not so much. However, Brazil has soy and all of their other raw materials, and China's a great partner for that. The US, not so much. So there's two competing needs there, again, right, where they don't necessarily have the greatest compatibility. And the question is, how do you try to balance those out? And we kind of see that a little bit with like the rollout of 5G, where they're trying to allow Huawei participation under certain circumstances and putting in certain limitations that other countries have tried to do as well, so that they don't necessarily alienate China, but they try to protect the most important and sensitive infrastructures or pieces that they have with them. So I don't think Brazil has to choose, but it's going to be very difficult to strike that balance.
Talking about the current situation of the world still, and about the pandemic specifically, this is a problem that, as you said before, has affected most of the countries in the world, and a lot of people is having problems still. But the US and the UK, for example, are coming out of this long winter with people getting vaccinated and being able to regain some normalcy in their lives. Brazil, we have a very slow vaccination process, and we still have almost 2,000 people dying every day, and people are talking about a third wave. So our situation is still not under control. How much do you think that affects Brazil as a global player?
I think in the short term, it will affect the role of Brazil, because in the short term, it greatly affects economic recovery. And the sooner the economies that can recover sooner and better and faster are going to fare much better, because any economic recovery is then going to translate into leverage and power that you have with other countries. So the longer it takes for a country to recover, the less of an advantageous position they will have. In that sense also, though, Brazil needs economic structural reforms as well. And so even if it had a quick economic recovery without those reforms, they would still have economic problems that put them at a disadvantage in terms of participating in the global financial and trade markets and things like that. But any country that can recover quickly or sooner than later in terms of the pandemic means that their economies are going to get back on track, most likely sooner than later. And the longer it takes, the harder it's going to be.
How about the debates about Brazil being a threat to the world in terms of creating being the place where more variants could appear, and we could have more waves of COVID spreading to different parts of the world? Do you think that's something legitimate, or is it something that, we're talking about India as well now, so it's not just Brazil.
You read my mind. I was just thinking India when you said that. I mean, it's a virus. Viruses are going to mutate, and people warned of the potential for mutations since the very beginning of COVID, right? This has been a constant thing. And the same debate is going on in the US right now. There's people that don't want to get vaccinated, and they're using the same argument of, well, if you don't get vaccinated, it leaves room for more mutations to form. And then who knows, maybe there'll be a strain that doesn't work with the vaccine, and you've just now endangered the entire US population. That conversation is being had in the US as well. So I think it's a problem for countries. I don't know if we know enough about the virus to say that any variant is more dangerous than the original one at this point, or if it's so drastically different that it would change anything. But I don't think you can hold a single country accountable for a virus change, because you've got India, Brazil, South Africa, UK. There's probably a bunch of other ones that we're not even aware of yet. And it's out of the control in some ways of any country to say, okay, let's stop a mutation of a virus. Like, that's just not something a government can control. There's measures you can take to mitigate that. But at the end of the day, a virus mutation is not, it's not something that human beings can easily regulate or control. If we could, like, we'd have one virus for the common cold and that would be it. But there's hundreds of viruses for the common cold. There's not much you can do about that.
We were talking about the role of Brazil in the post-pandemic role, and you were talking about the short term and the economics. What if we think about the longer term? What should be the focus of Brazil in terms of trying to gain a more relevant place in the world, in the post-COVID world?
I think the first thing they would need to do is figure out what they want that role to look like. What do they want to do, and what do they want to accomplish with that? And then through that, you can chart your strategy, right? If they want to do value-added exports as their main priority, that's one path. If they want to be the predominant power in the Southern Hemisphere, that's a different path. If they want to be a leader in defense, technology or aviation, something related to, all of their satellite systems and Embraer, that's another one. So longer term, there's a lot of different paths that I think Brazil can take. All of them require a strategy where you can put your resources and your time and your efforts. And until you figure out what you want that to look like, you're not going to really know where you're going.
Not that the decision is going to come from the US, but looking from Washington, what do you think should be the priority for the country? What do you think should be the better path for the country to follow?
Right now, I personally am a strong believer in the economic reforms. Those have been something that have been lacking for many years. And money helps solve problems. Let's not kid ourselves. And if you have a strong economy, you generally tend to have less social unrest. And so that would also help the political situation. And from there, you can kind of build on that positive momentum. So in terms of what I think Brazil's first steps in terms of trying to stabilize itself and move into a positive direction, I think, stabilizing the economy, passing those reforms, and working on economic development on those different fronts would yield the most results over time.
Bolsonaro, apart from all the problems related to him, was elected with the promise of bringing a lot of these reforms. Mm-hmm. So far, not much has been accomplished, and there's nothing really foreseen the foreseeable future that is going to change. At the same time, we're talking about the election next year, and our the other side of the political spectrum is coming back with Lula, and you can think about what reforms he did or didn't do during his administration. And so, in this context, how likely do you think it is to see a process of reforms? How do you read this near future of Brazil?
The interesting thing will be to see what the center parties are looking at, right? Because there are a bunch of center parties in Brazil that are saying, hey guys, we need to get our act together. We've got Bolsonaro, we've got Lula. They can look at the rest of the region, where you have two extremes, because the more center parties can't figure out a common platform, or one of the parties can't produce a candidate that would allow a more moderate or center type approach to politics, economics and policy and things like that. So, Peru right now is a great example of that, right? You had no consensus in the center, and now you've got two extreme candidates vying for the presidency in June. I think overall, over time, the national needs will always be there, no matter who's in charge. The question is, how do you go about solving those problems? And so I do think, to some extent, those economic reforms are going to occur no matter what over time, but the chances of them happening immediately are going to be significantly reduced if you have a very polarized leader taking over. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of people realize, we can't keep this level of government spending on salaries. We can't have, a taxation system that isn't working for us. We need to be able to bring in investors. And right now our regulations don't attract them the way we want to. And those will eventually create that type of situation. It's harder when you have a polarized party at the head of things, because then you have a lot of infighting that will occur throughout the process, as opposed to something more center where people can kind of get on board more easily.
Do you think it would be possible to see this center aligning with either of the sides to try to do that?
Well, I mean, or could they align with each other and leave the extremes out? Mm-hmm. I think it's a possibility. I think it's too early in elections to be able to tell this sort of thing. But the fact that these conversations are even being had, they're thinking about it, right? The biggest challenge for any of these types of alliances is always who gets power and how do you divide it? Because everybody always wants to be the top dog and the person in charge, and nobody wants to be the number two in some type of coalition talk. Brazil's seen this swing before in terms of having, a kingmaker party that will kind of oscillate back and forth of which party is going to be in charge and which one's going to be in the minority. So they're used to that. But what I don't think they're used to is having the center be such a large share of that, and having those, fringe. Now these main parties of left and right are more fringe. So that's a very different dynamic than having the main, center right, center left parties being the principal players, and then a small center party that can kind of just serve as the swing vote.
How do you think the U.S. again can influence that, considering that Biden was elected as a moderate, someone that would be a center politician, bringing back the U.S. from Trump's side, and now people are talking about his change to a more leftist politics in his administration. Do you think that may influence somehow the situation of the relation with Brazil and how Brazil follows the U.S.?
I think the greater than the Biden administration would be U.S. business, because in the U.S. the companies, the business sector is extremely powerful and has a lot of sway, and they work closely with the government, but they are not the government. And so in terms of what Brazil wants or needs, business relationships are great for that. The Biden administration can't promise a ton in the terms of investments, some trade deals, trade regulations, right? But at the end of the day, a lot of it comes down to business and different companies. And so I think the US companies saying, I want to see a better tax system, or I want to have greater regulatory security, or I need more flexibility with the administrative laws going around my company, that I think will speak to different political players more so than the US government at this point, because that's what really is what Brazil needs.
Just before we finish, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the environment as well, because this is something that people talk a lot about Brazil, and it's very important for the foreign relations of the country. And right now, the U.S. is putting some pressure on Brazil because of that. Since 2019 with Bolsonaro, we've seen more destruction in the Amazon, more deforestation, and a lot of countries are pressuring the country and have even, again, using the idea of Brazil being a threat to the world because of its responsibility for the environment. How do you see that as something that can be a burden, or something that can be helping Brazil in this pursuit of a place in the world?
I think right now it's a burden, because the interesting with climate is that nobody nobody's in charge of it, right? What you do in one place can have ramifications, thousands of miles away. And so there's this global concern in global policing, but at the end of the day, there's also national sovereignty. And I think with Brazil's case, it's very easy to tell a country, don't do this on your land. We don't want you to do it. It's very easy to tell other people what to do. And so because Brazil has the Amazon, of course, they're not going to give up national territory because other people tell them to. No country would do that. If you told somebody like, hey, I want you to give up, this giant mountain range, like the Himalayas don't belong to you anymore. It's a national, an international treasure of beautiful landscape. You don't give it up. And there's a strategic depth involved with the Amazon. And so there's beyond environmentalism, the reason why Brazil is so stern on its stance. It's not about the environment for Brazil at this point. It's about, hey, this is national territory. It's ours. We don't need other countries telling us what to do with this. And you can't govern your country based on the way other people tell you to, or at least Brazil is big enough that it doesn't have to worry about that. There's going to be consequences with businesses, again, trying to pressure Brazil to do what they want. But in the same way that like the US has, drilled for oil in the Gulf of Mexico, they did a huge fracking endeavor in the southern borders of the countries, primarily in Texas. Fracking also has terrible, arguably like environmental consequences. And there's been campaigns in other places of the world against fracking. But it would be unheard of for somebody in Europe to start a campaign to say, hey, US, stop drilling off the Gulf of Mexico, or hey, US, stop doing your fracking, and expect the United States to say, oh, okay, if that's what you want. Like no one would ever say that kind of scenario. But because of that, all of these countries have their own agendas in terms of pursuing green agendas that serve their own national interests. And so when you see that clash between the green energy agendas between countries, it's going to be, I think, a little bit of a detriment for Brazil because they can't give up their ability to control their own territory. And at the same time, these other countries in Europe and stuff have their own reasons for wanting to pursue green energy, green policies and technology and development that they aren't going to let up on it. And they're not going to let up, which means Brazil is unfortunately kind of stuck in that position of a no-win situation there.
Just to finish, when we started, you were saying that Brazil has all the fundamentals to be an emerging country and has been emerging for a long time and will always be emerging. How optimistic do you think Brazilians could be about their country nowadays, or how hard would it be to actually try to leave the emerging behind and become emerged and really come out of it?
Right. I mean, right now, I don't think anyone's very optimistic about anything. You need to, it's a trickle-down effect, right? So if you can get the economy up and running, people get more confident. If you can get the politics to be effective and gain confidence in that, you can get people on board. But right now, there's minimal faith in the economy. There's minimal faith in the ability for the economy to recover, and there's minimal faith in the political institutions. So you're not going to see anyone getting on that bandwagon anytime soon. But over time, if the economy can improve, if a strong political leadership and renewal of faith in the institution emerges, then you can have that trickle-down effect where people start realizing like, oh, hey, we can do this. But again, you have to have the structures there. And so while you have pieces there, they're not put together yet.
Alison, thank you very much for your time. It was really interesting talking to you and to see your perspective on the situation of the country. And I think it really helps us think about ourselves and what we're going to do for our future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.